So let's go ahead and get started. Tonight we're going to talk about vacuum chucking. And just to clarify, when Joe recommended the title of tonight's meeting, he said everything you need to know about vacuum chucking. That's false. It's everything that I know about vacuum chucking. At the end, Joe will be glad to take all of your hard or difficult questions. So I just thought I just go ahead and thought I'd clear the air on that, because there's a different. I know that a vacuum chuck works. I kind of understand it, but there's a specific difference between knowledge and understanding. All of this involves a lot of math, science, physics, things that I barely got through in high school. And I don't understand how it all works. It just works. My brother, on the other hand, he not only wanted to know how it worked, he wanted to know why it worked and understood how it worked. Take computers, for example. Right now, he is in computer science, and he can tell you everything that you need to know about computers. All I know is I mash the button on the computer, I click, add to the cart, click the button, and it shows up at my house in a couple of days. So I don't understand how that works. I just know how it works. So I like to tell people that he got the brains and I got the looks. And yes, he is hideous. So when we say vacuum, or as the British like to say, Hoover for some reason, you ever get to wonder that we didn't fight the Revolutionary War over taxes? We just didn't want to talk the way they did anymore. We wanted to call vacuum cleaners vacuum cleaners. We wanted to drive on the right side of the road. And we wanted to get away from the metric system and use something better. Fractions. So why vacuum? There are several different ways to hold a piece on a lathe. When you buy a lathe, typically it's going to come with a faceplate, a live center, and a spur drive. And that's pretty much all you get. The cheapest part about wood turning is the lathe itself. You're going to spend probably 2 or 3 times more in accessories on top of the lathe. So you buy the scroll chucks, you buy the more face plates, you buy just all different kinds of stuff. And it can add up. And what I'd like to try to get across tonight is that you don't have to spend as much money as what they want you to spend. I did some research on this. I couldn't find, and maybe one of you know, who the first wood turner was that used a vacuum chuck. Does anybody know? Okay, I couldn't find that either. But at some point in time in the past, a wood turner was probably vacuuming the house and just had a monumental, one of those eureka moments. Went out to the shop, put a vacuum on there, discovered that it worked. We typically use a vacuum chuck, not for the initial turning, but for the finishing up of the bottom of the piece. Light turning, sanding, removing that nub at the bottom, or removing the tenon. Now there are alternatives to that. One is being a cold jaw, or using cold jaws on your. Now, I've had these and I've used them, and I wish somebody could tell me the best way. If I've got a 6-inch bowl, where do I need to place these things the first time? Okay, you have to do it at least 3 times to find that spot? Okay. So I'm not the only one that undoes all 8 of these to find out it's too small or too big. Okay. That's one of my main gripes with the cold jaws. Longworth, I've never had any experience with those, but I understand that they're not a whole lot better than cold jaws. And then you have the donut chucks, which again I don't have any experience in. And then the most common one is the jam chuck. You pretty much have the piece of wood on your scroll chuck, and you turn that to the inside shape of your piece, and you jam it up, hence the name. And I mean, you can almost turn it almost down to just a little piece of the nubbin left on the bottom, and then take it off. But the problem about jam chucks is that unless you're turning the same bowl, same dimension all the time, you're going to need several different jam chucks, and you may have to reconfigure that jam chuck to fit that particular piece that you're working on. A vacuum chuck or a vacuum system, you're going to need either a vacuum pump or an inverter. And I'll try to talk a little bit about those here in just a second. But on a vacuum system or a vacuum pump, there's several different ones available. Diaphragm, piston, single or dual vane, such as a Gast, which is a popular brand name, or Robinair, that's another brand name for a vacuum pump. I think there's one called the Excalibur, but essentially they all work the same. They're common in HVAC work, such as this one right here, and I don't know, I'm gonna put this over here. The problem with vacuum pumps is that they can be expensive. The cheapest vacuum pump I've been able to find is, of course, Harbor Freight. They want $90 for their cheapest vacuum pump. And they can go anywhere between $90 up to $1,000. It's all depending on what you want to spend, how much CFM you want. This one is a 1.5 CFM. It's at the bottom line of vacuum pumps, but it does everything I need it to do. I bought that one, and keep your eyes up on Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace. They do pop up. I got that one from on Craigslist from a mechanic. There's a shade tree mechanic. He was, he did his own little HVAC work and working on cars. He got a full-time job at one of the major dealerships in the area, decided he didn't need it anymore, so he sold it. And I picked it up for $60. So you keep your eyes open. You can find one that's reasonable enough. This one uses oil. Some people complain about the oil. Basically, when it's running, you're going to have an oil vapor coming out of it. You can put a filter on there or a containment on the filter itself. But that one uses oil. That you can get them that are oilless. Some have a filter built in. This one, I have installed a fuel filter off of a lawnmower. And the only reason that that's there, and the only reason that you really want to put a filter on here is because when you start pulling air, or a vacuum on your spindle, when you're turning, your dust is going into your spindle, and it will go into your oil, and you'll be exchanging that or replacing that more often than you want. I get my oil at it's either, I think it might be Advance. It's either Advance or AutoZone. That's a quart of it. I think I paid $9 a quart. So I've used about half of that one, but I think I've only replaced the oil in that maybe twice. And the first time I replaced the oil in it is because I had to, because I also used that to stabilize wood. And I accidentally pulled in some cactus juice into the vacuum pump. And I told Dwayne I'd talk a little bit about stabilizing. The way I've got mine configured, and it was by happy accident, I've got this side going to the lathe, this side going to a vacuum chamber. But when I'm using it on the lathe, I can use this other side as a bleeder valve, so I won't be pulling as much pressure as the vacuum's pulling. Basically, stabilizing wood is taking punky wood, and you fill that. The wood has to be 0% dry, period. You immerse it into resin, which is called cactus juice, in a vacuum chamber. Turn on the vacuum, and it sucks all of the air out of the wood. And then once the bubbles stop, you release the vacuum, and all that resin that it's been soaking in goes into those straw pores, empty places, and then you let it soak for twice as long as it was under vacuum. So it may take 3 or 4 days. I stabilized a piece full of cherry burl last year for Tony in my vacuum chamber with this pump, and the pump ran for 2.5 days solid. You can't cut it off until the bubbles start coming up out of the wood. And then once the bubbles stop, release the vacuum. So it took, it was a pretty big piece of cherry burl. So it took a week to stabilize that piece, and then you put it in the oven and cure it. and basically that piece of wood is now resin and wood, and it can weigh 3 or 4 times as much as it was when you put it in. The next thing is, and when I was doing research, because I really wanted to pass up on as much information as I knew and what I could find out on the internet. You can go to YouTube and find all kinds of videos on vacuum chucks and vacuum systems. I saw some where people were using, converting old air compressors and even shop-vacs for a vacuum system. Technically, it does work. But if you have a shop-vac hook up to this rotary adapter and you're pulling a vacuum on this side, the shop-vac, first of all, is loud. I mean, nobody likes to hear the sound of a shop-vac going. Second of all, the shop-vac motor is not designed to work like that. And third, and what I thought was the most interesting thing about all of the shop-vac vacuum system videos that I saw, people would have their bowl on their vacuum chuck, turn the lathe on, it's spinning, it's holding in place. But not one of them put a tool to it. Because once you put a tool to that piece of wood, even though vacuum's pulling this way, you've got less than half the force that's going this way, going this direction. So say if you got with a shop-vac, I don't know how many pounds of pressure you can pull with one, but let's just say 50 pounds. If you've got 50 pounds of pressure pulling this way because of the shop-vac, it only takes 25 pounds to move it this direction. So I don't know exactly how many pounds of pressure that it takes to move a 14 PSI. Okay. So it's not going to take a whole lot with this bowl gouge when you hit that piece of wood for it to become a missile. So that, and another thing I thought was curious about, you can look at the YouTube and the guys, just going crazy because of his shop-vac system. And then people in the comments, dude, that's awesome. I got to try that. I'm definitely going to try that. I'm afraid there were a lot of disappointed people when they did that, went to the trouble of doing that. And then when they put a gouge to it, it popped off. The next thing, and I talked to Dwayne a little bit before this, about you can get vacuum generators or inverters. And what those are, Laguna makes one for their lathes, and Holdfast makes one for their lathe. They work off the Venturi effect. And Venturi is named after the 18th physicist Giovanni Battista Venturi. You know how I know that? Google. Or it's Joe's family. Yeah. But they will require an air compressor. And all depending on what type of air compressor you have, it may or may not kick in. Air compressors are again loud. Harbor Freight vacuum generator, $18. Now, it's $18 because first of all, it's Harbor Freight. And second of all, it requires an immense amount of air to pull a vacuum on this side. Specs call for 4.5 CFM at 90 PSI, which is a lot of air moving through here. I've got a 60-gallon air compressor. I keep it at 110, 120 PSI most of the time. When I tested this up, my air compressor was silent for the first 30 seconds. And then after that, it could not keep up with this. So this is probably one of the most inefficient vacuum generators that can be made. But when I was doing my research and talking to Dwayne, Holdfast, they sell one, and I wish you'd have known you had it. I had to bring it tonight. But Holdfast, they're comparable in price with Laguna's. They're $250. They come with their own little regulator. Laguna does not come with the vacuum chucks. Holdfast comes with 2 vacuum chucks and a lamp rod for the adapter. So look at Holdfast, or if you have a Laguna lathe, I think But if I'm not mistaken, the 1836 and the 2436 Laguna are the only two that have the threaded hand wheel, or it actually threads into the hand wheel itself. Let's see, holdfast specs say they only require 1.2 CFM at 85 PSI for 25 inches of mercury, compared to Harbor Freight, which requires 4.5 CFM. And honestly, if I'd have had a vacuum gauge, a spare vacuum gauge, I'd have put it on there. But I wasn't pulling a lot of vacuum with this one. But I mean, it worked. I put it on my little lathe. I put a bowl on there, and it worked. I mean, it held it, but I'm not going to say how well it held it. Let's see. Next thing is the hose and tubing. The hose that runs from your vacuum pump into your adapter. I bought this at Ace Hardware. It's 1/4 inch tube. I think it was like 25, maybe 30 cents a foot. Any tube will work, braided or unbraided, as long as it doesn't collapse. You want that tube to be rigid and sturdy, because if it collapses, then you're not pulling any air at all. That's a good question. The question is if you can hold 50 pounds of pressure on a bowl here, why doesn't it collapse the tube? A small diameter, and the force is going the opposite direction. You know, I looked at Frugal and I did some research on that, and best I could tell is somebody on one of the forums said that he was trying to get out of the business. He's still around? Okay. 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 Go to Google Frugal vacuum chuck. Google Frugal. There's a guy, I think he's up in Illinois. Can you call him and say, I've got X amount of lathe, and he will put together a system for you?
In fact, you have to tell him what kind of lathe you have, especially the spindle, designed specifically for your lathe.
Okay. Okay. So Google Frugal. When I was talking about vacuum chucks, this is one that I recently made. And what made me want to do a demonstration of this, I wanted to tell everybody what to do and what not to do, because I learned a lot just by making this one vacuum chuck. I wanted to make a vacuum chuck, so of course, what do? You go to YouTube. I found Carl Jacobson's video where he made a similar vacuum chuck, but instead of threading the faceplate himself, he used an existing faceplate, mounted it to a piece of MDF, and just run a hole through here, and he was able to pull a vacuum through the faceplate. I didn't want to spend that much money just for a faceplate, just for a vacuum chuck. So that's where the spindle taps come into play, when you can find them and whenever Dwayne doesn't corner the market. So anyway, I went to Carl Jacobson's video. I watched him make his vacuum chuck. I went out to the shop. I said, all right, I'm going to do about the same thing, but I'm not going to use a faceplate. I'm going to do the thread and on. So what I did, in fact, this is one that I made when I was gluing everything together. I made this one as well. And I put this on the spindle. I'm talking about this one. I put it on the spindle, put the vacuum on there, held my hand on there, and I was only pulling like five inches of mercury, which is not a lot and not enough. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. Couldn't figure it out. Some of you guys already know what I'm talking about. So I said, all right, there's got to be a leak somewhere. There's a leak in my hand. So I said, there's got to be a leak somewhere. So I saturated the outside with CA glue, and I've glued my fingers together a time or two with that stuff. Saturated with thin CA, put my hand on there, still not doing anything. I said, what is going on here? So I turned the gasket, and I don't see it out anywhere. I put a gasket back there. All right, well, that's not working. So what's going on here? What I came to find out, that this surface here is the only part that's pulling vacuum. That's 1.25 inches. That's the only part that's pulling a vacuum. And the more surface area that you have, like you were talking about, the more of a vacuum you pull. So I went ahead and cleaned this out, opened it up, and all I did was, the backside of this foam is been saturated with thin CA, put the foam on there, and the first time this acrylic plate, put the acrylic plate on here, and it worked fine. The more surface area you have, the more force, the more open surface. What I was able to find is that 1 inch of mercury, and 1 inch of mercury is just basically a measurement for atmospheric pressure. If you're pulling 20 inches of mercury on your vacuum pump, that's roughly 10 pounds of pressure, 10 PSI. You take that 10 PSI and you multiply it by how many square inches are in this surface. And that gives you your pound of, how much force can be applied at this with a perfect seal at 20 PSI. So say, for example, this is 17.7 square inches. You take 17.7 square inches, multiply that by 10 PSI, say we're pulling 20 on it. That surface. This doesn't matter. The length doesn't matter. The length is only there. Yeah, this part is only there because if it's a bowl, you're going to run into your headstock if this length or this length isn't there. But here, all of this is your square inches of surface area. So this has 17.7 square inches here. And it's radius times pi. And that gives you your square inches. See, I told you we were going to get into math and physics and all that, and a lot of that's over my head. But I went ahead and did some calculations. A 4-inch diameter piece, and this is not 4 inches. I think this is more like 4.5. Yeah, 4 3/4. So a 4-inch piece of PVC has roughly 12.5 square inches. In fact, I think that might be this one. Yeah, this is a 4-inch piece. This has 12.5 square inches on this chuck here. At 20 inches of mercury, it can pull 125 pounds of force. That's considering you don't have any leaks in your system, and we'll go over that in just a little bit. But yes, 125 pounds of force. Comparatively speaking, a 10-inch diameter chuck, and of course this is nowhere near that, but a 10-inch diameter chuck has 78.5 square inches, and that will pull 785 pounds of pressure. So, Joe, that maple bowl that I brought for show and tell. So in something like this, by the way, Gary, remember this piece of wood? Well, Gary gave me a piece of wood. He said it was spalted maple. It was more like rotten maple. But I was able to salvage that off of it. So this is a thin wall. So I'm going to, yeah, I don't want to crack it. Well, I don't have anything. I've only hand tightened everything. But right now I'm pulling 12, 13. And it takes a little bit to get it off. If I had that on a 10-inch chuck with 785 pounds of pressure going in this direction, it would be one of Bruce's bowls. It would shatter it. I'm sorry? But yes, it would shatter that. So, and I mentioned earlier about force going in this direction. If you've got 125 pounds pulling in that direction, which we didn't have it at that point, I'm pulling 12 inches of mercury, which is roughly 6 PSI, so 6 times 144 pounds. Right now, it's pulling as much vacuum as it can pull because, again, this is hand tightened. The question is that how do you know where do you set your vacuum gauge or your vacuum pump before you put a vacuum to avoid preventing that? A lot of it may come from experience. If you're dealing with a thick bowl, you probably don't have a whole lot to worry about. But yes, when you're pulling a thin piece, I would open up that bleeder valve. I'm introducing air into the system by opening that bleeder valve. But when I shut it, I'm closing it. Now I'm pulling a full vacuum. But again, I'm only pulling 12 PSI. So yeah, I'm not pulling a whole lot. Another thing that can happen to your piece is that if you got sanding sealer or any kind of finish whatsoever, it'll pull it out. It'll pull a vacuum will pull the finish on the outside of a bowl to the inside of the bowl, even when it's wet. And again, if you've got a vacuum pump, you really don't want water in it. That water and oil don't mix very well, and it can. No, it'll rust this entire part in there, and you have to take it apart. It's a mess. So you really don't want water in there either. Not that you're going to be pulling a whole lot of water if you've got a piece of green wood up here, but yes, that vacuum pressure will pull the water out of the wood in that one spot. There is a guy, his name is Curtis Seebeck, and if you want to get into stabilizing wood, he is the guy to go to. In fact, he invented cactus juice. He invented the resin. And a lot of the guys that stabilize pen blanks, they come into that problem. I mean, that's an actual problem where they're sucking resin into their vacuum pump. He's got a pump saver, and essentially it's like a $40 piece of $40 canister, and it acts as a reservoir. Water, the liquid comes into the reservoir, but only air comes out. This is side grain. We're putting vacuum pressure on side grain. End grain isn't going to have the same effect, is it? Is it not? It's going to have a different effect. With something like oak, which is
forget it for red oak. You can't use red oak with palm. It's got
like palm.
heavy palm.
Okay, because the straws or the fibers are so porous, it's just going to. Yeah. And in fact, I was going to show something about that here in just a little bit. Hopefully, I haven't tried it yet, but we're going to try an experiment tonight. Well, what I was going to get to with this bowl, if we've got 125 pounds of pressure here, you're looking at less than half the pressure in going in this direction. So if you got 125 here, you know, less than 67.5, is that half of 125? I'm testing my math skills tonight. You got that less than that much pressure going in this direction, so it's going to take a lot less to push it this way than to pull it in this direction.
So would that mean that if you're going to make your own shop, you want to turn that in so that the pressure is from the middle against the wall?
I'm going to get into MDF, and I've got my own little quirks with that. So then it was already brought up. Let's go ahead and test this thing for leaks. And I want to show you how to test your vacuum system for leaks. What I have here is the rotary adapter that is for this lathe. And I've got a spanner on order, so in the meantime, I'm using a great big pair of channel locks. So we're going to tighten this down. And I hope, yes, Teflon tape is, it can be a requirement for vacuum chucks. So always have some on hand. I mean, last time I checked, I had 7 rolls in my house. You always have Teflon tape for one reason or another. In fact, there was one time I went to Lowe's just for a roll of Teflon tape. You know what I found when I got back home? 3 rolls of Teflon tape. Okay. So I think I've got that pretty much tightened. We're going to put a vacuum on it. And with my hand, I can pretty much seal it. But You can use a racquetball, or what I have is a rubber plug. And we're going to seal that off. Now, I'm pulling 30. So I pretty much have a full vacuum on this system right now. So I turn off the vacuum pump, and I want to watch the needle. I'll turn it where hopefully everybody can see it. Is it moving? Not much. Then I've got a tight seal. So that tells me I don't have any leaks from here all the way to here. Now I just let off the vacuum. So now what I want to do is put the vacuum chuck back on. If you run into any leaks, put some Teflon tape around your spindle. And that should alleviate most of your issues. So now, since I tightened this adapter, remember when I put this up here the last time, I only hadn't had hand tighten this. Now I am pulling 22. So I'm pulling 22 inches of mercury, 11 times 12 and a half. Anybody? Bueller, a lot. Now, I don't have, remember when I had the rubber plug in here, I was pulling a full vacuum at 30. Now I'm only pulling 22. That tells me I've got leaks either in the spindle, which I can fix with Teflon tape, or hopefully fix, or it's coming through here. Okay. What I did with this piece is when I opened it up, I went ahead and run another bead of silicone in through here. I wanted to prevent any leaks that may be coming from this bottom piece of MDF. So I saturated that with thin CA. I saturated I went ahead and curved over this top piece of MDF and put the rubber foam, which by the way, the rubber foam, you can get this at Hobby Lobby or Michael's. It's a closed cell foam. It's probably, I'll go ahead and pass that piece around. It's probably 1/16 of an inch thick. It's closed cell foam, and it's adhesive on the back. So you can use spray adhesive if you wanted to, but it holds just fine. There are different ways that you can, other foams that you can use, but from my experience, which is of course limited, but from my experience, it's better to use a thin foam rather than a soft foam such as this. This soft foam, it's going to hold a vacuum. But when you have your piece on there, it's going to translate into a lot of wobble that you're going to have. So I wanted to make a quick vacuum chuck. And if I can find my pieces. So basically what I have here is I have a waste block. Let me take that off. I have a waste block on my chuck that I have used double stick tape to stick on two pieces of MDF that were previously glued together. And to prevent as much mess in here as possible, I went ahead and turned this to shape at the house, because MDF, it stands for medium density fiberboard. But I think the D in MDF stands for dust, and the F stands for something other than fiberboard, because it makes an absolute mess. I would recommend using, it doesn't matter what you cut MDF with, it's going to make an absolute mess. So I went ahead and put that on there, turned it to shape, and drilled 1 1/8" hole in the middle of it. If you're going to be tapping 1 1/4", use an 1 1/8" Forstner bit. If you're going to be tapping an inch tap, use a 7/8. Always use an 1/8 lower. So I went ahead and tapped this just to prevent a lot of the mess. And I use an old live center because there's a dimple in the bottom of that tap that needs to be perfectly aligned with this piece. Oh, and another thing, I don't know if you can see it on camera, I chamfered the inside of this just slightly so that the tip of that tap, tip of that tap would go in there just so. It doesn't open up that far. Doesn't open up that far. I've tried it. So what I'm doing here is I'm pushing in just snugly on that tap and running it forward and back. Run it forward and back. Now you can stand, I don't want to just make you sit through all this. But what I'm doing is I'm just slowly going in a little bit at a time. MDF machines beautifully. That's the only positive thing about it. But the problem is that when after you tap this and you've got your threads, you need to use thin CA to coat those threads. Give that a good coating and then run your tap back through. And what that does is that the CA is going to soak in to the MDF and make it hard. And then you're going to run that tap back through there to clean out those threads. And if you wanted to, you can go ahead and do it a third time just for a little bit extra added stability. I haven't found the need in that. Cheap. It's easy to machine. I don't know if I brought it with me tonight or not. I did this one out of maple. When I was doing this part, it got to the point I don't know what I was doing wrong, but it took a long time to thread this maple versus this MDF. HDPE. Yes, if you can find blocks thick enough, HDPE is the thing to use. I'm gonna stop there. So when you're backing this thing out, as you can see, I was just holding it kind of steady, trying to back it out easy. You want to back it out the same way it went in, or you're going to goober up your threads. So one thing I forgot to discuss when we were talking about vacuum chucks is there's another vacuum chuck that you can make, and essentially it's just a faceplate, piece of MDF or plywood. And what you would do is first of all, drill a hole in the middle of it, of course, to allow for the vacuum pressure to come through. Put silly foam or funny foam or whatever this closed cell foam is called on top of it. And you can use that as a vacuum chuck. A couple of issues with it, however, is remember when we were talking about surface area? This piece is, I don't know, let's say it's 10 inches. If you've got a 10-inch bowl on this vacuum chuck, you've got 10 inches of surface area or whatever we equated that to, you're pulling a lot of pressure on that bowl with this amount of surface area. The second problem with this is that your bowl, the rim of your bowl has to be perfectly true and flat, or it's just not going to seal at all. But this can be another vacuum chuck. So getting back to this vacuum chuck that we were working on, what you would do from this point, let me see if I'm going to try to do it real quick. Every lathe has a spot on the back side of the spindle that registers true the entire time. And you need to make sure that whatever your surface here needs to be completely flat. You need to make that indentation and make that register for your lathe. The shoulder of your spindle. The shoulder of your spindle, you can zoom in here. That's going to run true. That part right there. So anything, any adapter or any faceplate or anything that you make, this part of your faceplate or your vacuum chuck needs to be flat to register up against there. And you also need to create a recess around before your threads for this piece to register. Now let's say I did do that register on the back. What I'm going to do, well, again, just to save time, I did not put CA glue and tighten up these threads. But the next step in creating a vacuum chuck is take your PVC or your PVC coupler, and we want to create a groove for that to fit in. Got a cone live center. Again, that's handmade and threaded to adapt for your live center. Bring the PVC up here. Bring it in tight. And that's running a little bit out of true. But that's going to give me a starting place where to cut the groove. So what I want to do is I want to start out where I know, yeah, this ain't it. I want to start out where I know that I'm to the good. Yeah, okay. You get the idea. This is where dust collecting is a must. But cut your groove coming in slowly at a time, or coming out slowly at a time, making sure that fits with each pass. Just a little bit at a time until you can get that to just fit. I was using, you can use epoxy, CA glue. Joe uses RTV glue to secure that in there. But you want this piece, I would say, to at least be a ½ inch deep into your faceplate here in order for that to be a secure fit. Now it's going to be secure because it's up against, the PVC is going to be a ½ inch deep up against that wall, tight up against that wall, but you want it to be a ½ inch deep to give it a little bit more added security. I've got another chuck over here, this one, with the PVC already glued in. So when you have your PVC on there, what you would want to do then is take your parting tool and true that edge up and sand it over if you needed to. Take your funny foam. And I'm going to put that over there just like that. Now, you can use scissors to cut that out to shape if you want. Easiest way to do it is with a box cut. Watch this. See, that's a bowl gouge right there. So now you have got a vacuum chuck. Now let's give this a test shot. And I've got all that dust in the line now. Okay, somebody tell me what, we're pulling 19 inches of hickory. So 8 times 18, 144. That's on there pretty good. So I'm pretty happy with that vacuum chuck. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to show, we'll put this back on here, is the practical applications and how to use a vacuum and ways that you can use a vacuum chuck. Now, a vacuum chuck, it's not the end all be all. It's a good tool to have. You can have your cold jaws, your scroll chucks, your jam chucks, this, that, and the other. The vacuum chuck is just another tool to have. But there's a couple different ways to mount a piece to a vacuum chuck. First way is you can do it by eye. And we're going to go ahead and put that on there. It's a total waste. Yes, yes. But if you are the first thing, you're right, that was easier. If at all possible on your turnings, always keep that live center dimple. That's always going to give you true center. But if for some reason that's missing, there's always a way to do it. Let's put it on the lathe chuck. I'm not going to bring it up to full pressure because I'm not going to be turning this one. Bring your tool rest up. Up to that tenon. And I don't know if you can, yeah, they can see it. It's what I'm doing is I'm looking straight down. And that's a little bit closer to the tenon there. So I'm going to do the little bump and run method. Bleed off a little bit more. Or that, and I'm going to get to that part. But you can do that. The easiest part, of course, is using your live center. Turn the vacuum off. Using your live center, bring this up. Put your little hole or your little dimple, your live center dimple in there. Bring it up. Now it's flush. Turn on the vacuum. You ready? And now you're running true. So right now we are pulling 22 on this little piece. So we've got more than an adequate pressure on here. But if there's one thing I want to stress tonight, don't turn anything. Leave the tailstock in place as long as possible. Even though this will probably work and you can turn that entire tenon off, it's best to leave that tailstock in place until the last minute. Always leave it in if you can, if at all possible. One other thing I was going to show, a little trick. What I was wondering, this is a piece of ash. Ash is like oak. It's very porous. But we're probably looking this thing, it may be 3/4 of an inch at the base thick. So I'm able to pull enough vacuum. But if you're not able to pull enough vacuum, I had to ask my wife where she keeps the saran wrap because I didn't know. But you can take saran wrap. Let's see if it brings up the vacuum when I do this. No, not a whole lot. If your piece is porous, use saran wrap, and that will hold it or create more of a vacuum for you, so it won't be running through the pores quite as bad. And if you're wondering on what to do with the saran wrap on there, when you've got your bowl gouge, it doesn't care if that saran wrap or wood. Your bowl gouge is going to cut right through this just like it will wood. So that's one little trick. You've still got pores. It's still porous. It doesn't matter which way you turn it. A piece of wood is going to be porous. Of course, end grain is going to have more pores because you've got basically just straws and that's it. The last thing I want to do is I want to show how to mount a bowl that is still on the chuck. Now, those that were here last month might remember me winning a piece of a poplar bowl blank in a raffle. That's it. So, like with any other bowl, you start with turning the outside. You turn a tenon or recess. In this case, I've turned a recess. Turn a recess on it, or sand and finish the outside of the bowl. Inverse it onto the chuck, turned it out, and finished it up. Now what I want to do is I want to hide any evidence of how it was mounted on the lathe. Because if you If you hand a bowl to somebody on the street, they're going to look at the bowl and say, oh, nice bowl. If you give a wood turner a bowl, what's the first thing you're going to do? They're going to turn the thing over because they want to see how it was mounted on the lathe. Wood turners are a strange bunch. But anyway, this is a live center spindle adapter. And that part spins. It's Morse 2. And this part is a 1/8 spindle. I got the adapter to take it to a 1 1/4 spindle. Turn that over. Take it off the headstock. Turn it around. And you can also do this with cold jaws. Put the vacuum chuck back on. Make that snug. Turn on the vacuum. And we'll make it a little bit snugger. Turn that bleeder off. Okay, 21 inches of mercury. I think that's fine. Let's pull that off and see if I can. No, I want to take this off first. I'm going to see if I can. There we go. I want it. Hit me again. So there's plenty enough force on there to keep the bowl on there. Release it. I'm going to get home and I'm going to clean this up even more, but you can get the idea where you want to remove the evidence of how it was mounted. Does anybody have any questions? Because that's where I'm going to stop. Thank you. Joe, it's all you now.
My part of the conversation is going to be on the actual adapter. There's two schools of thought on adapters. One is what Laguna does, and that's put one in the tailstock. I kind of like the through adapter. These are some that I made quite a while back. These original ones, and they were pretty big, and they all use a lamp rod to go through. These are all adapters in one fashion or another, and they all have the same thing. Air goes in here, and there's no place for it to leak except around here, which I put a little bit of epoxy on mine when I put them in here, or CA glue. It's never going to leak around here. The next place you're going to have any leakage is going to be out at this tip. So anything goes on between here and here, there's no loss of air whatsoever. This rod is extra long for this lathe here. I don't have to worry about sealing this right here, although I do have a rubber gasket that's made for this. It slips right over here. It's a tube with a flange on it. I have a knob on this right here now that lets me tighten up on this. This thing wants a turn. Do, 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 do. This is a bit overkill, but it'll do the job. I got it. This is doing it. I just want to snug it up right there. So basically, what you have is air coming in here and air coming right in here. So there's actually no loss of air anywhere between here and here. So now with your different adapters, as long as you have a good flush seal right here, you have virtually no loss of air at this point. You have a good vacuum at this point, and it works beautifully. This can be for any size chuck you want to make. I have some O-ring seals that I bought from Amazon actually to fit this, and I snug it up. And I do not have to use any tape on mine, but you can use tape on this, and that would also minimize the loss. But this is the only place where you're going to get loss, here or in your chuck itself. So you don't have any loss of air anywhere else. Now, yes. More than that? Okay, right there. Okay. Now, I am working on one little project. Any of you who have been plumbers know that there's a thing as a pressure tester. You put this on a pipe. Show you what it looks like. John, where's that one I gave you? Oh, yeah. Anyway, you take this guy and you plug it in. This is made for a 3-inch pipe. You stick it in the pipe and you tighten it up. And basically, there's no loss of air in there. I mean, it's tight. It's unbelievably tight. So what I've done, I took a faceplate and screwed on. Oh, this is too long right now. But anyway, to show you how it's going to work. This goes in here. This goes in here. This. Oh, okay, this goes on, and this rod goes through, all the way through to here, and this nut now tightens this up. So you have one adapter. I mean, one device that you could put a ton of different pieces of 3-inch PVC on here. Any shape, you put a 3-inch to 4-inch transition, and you really have a good device. Let me see if I can get this thing through.
You had to do that because somebody took your tap.
But okay, this is on now.
It's been all
But it's tight. Now at this point, I could tell you there'd be basically very little leak, if any, in here. But with this on here and that on here, you now have something that you can make quick change chucks for. Just slip them on here and tighten up your nut, and you now have an expansion device, and it really holds it quite well. I have a different lathe, so this won't work on this lathe here, but my lathe. But anyway, I'm a proponent of through the shaft. I don't particularly care for the chucks on the end. There's too many places for error in between, too much place for air release. This one here, I've got between here and here, there's no other place for air to go. So you can't get any leakage. That actually is, yeah, that's the bearing. And what it is, yeah, it's a piece of PVC. Oops. Yeah, these are different adapters. I've been playing around with these and making them. The first ones I made were big. This is one I made on my metal lathe. I turned that one out of steel. And they're just small bearings. You mount the bearings in PVC. And then you put a piece of wood in there and tap it to this thread like so. And you're talking like $6-7, and you got you a complete system, really. And it works great. This one here fits my lathe, and it screws right in. But this one here is maybe actually a piece of cap over a piece of PVC. I buy them, they're not skate bearings. They're actually double sealed ball bearings. They're inexpensive, and you can buy them with a flange or without a flange. But how you make that is really immaterial. It's very simple to do. Just put 2 bearings or 3 bearings or 1 bearing. Actually, the metal, this one right here, there's only 1 bearing in it. I'm using smaller bearings. The more area of the bearing, the more surface area you have for leakage. So the smaller, the better. You don't need, there's no load on that. So you don't need a massive bearing. So I've gone to smaller bearings and they work better. These are some of the old ones I made and they worked quite well. They really did. But these little ones work better. Actually, I have less room for error because they're smaller. You know, this is one size, one time when bigger isn't better. It really is. These work, but
Now, Joe, you gave a demonstration on these probably a couple of years ago, and there's a handout on our website.
Right.
If anybody's interested in doing it, will you have another handout based on your new renditions?
These are pretty simple. I mean, just a matter of slipping, pushing 2 bearings up inside a piece of PVC.
Okay.
It really is not rocket science to do those. Yeah. These work good. But I really found out that PVC and wood works as good as anything, and the smaller the better. They say get away from the big bearings. On this one here, I had more trouble sealing these bigger bearings because they're bigger. You have more surface area to deal with. Vacuum chucking is a great thing. I use it a lot. I've got an old Harbor Freight pump, and I've been using it now for over 5 years, and I've never had a problem with it. I do have a filter on it, but any questions on those adapters, rotary adapters? They're real easy to make, as long as there's a space between the threaded rod and the bearing, and you could either put a straight barb out, or I like to put the L barb so the cord is down rather than trying to put pressure on it. And those lamp rods, you can buy them at anywhere in 24-inch length, so you cut them to your size.
There's one thing that I forgot to mention as far as vacuum gauges go, and that is every system should have a vacuum gauge to tell you pretty much where you're at as far as inches of mercury. But those should be taken with a grain of salt and just as a rule of thumb, because very few vacuum gauges, unless you're spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars on them, are calibrated.
Right.
So it may show that you're pulling 22, you may be pulling 20 or 24. It varies, but it gives you a good rule of thumb where to start. 29.5 is pretty much all you can pull right here, and that's a solid vacuum, and it varies by sea level. But from my experience,
Long enough now.
if you're pulling 15 to 20 with wood turning, that's sufficient. That's more than enough in most cases to hold your piece on, especially when you've got your tailstock on there most of the time.
Of course, again, it don't have to be tight. I'm going to put the nut on the other end of this now. And that's all you need. There's no place for the air to leak. Yeah, at this point it would, but okay. See that piece that's on there right now. So this here could in fact be your. If this was sealed up, you now have a vacuum chuck, and all you have to do is make a few of these. And this thing here, this adapter will work with a variety of. So you don't have to make a faceplate or threaded faceplate for everyone. You could just build this one jig right here, and make all the adapters you wanted, and it's tight. It's not going to leak. Okay, let me go right over here. This good right here, John?
Yes.
Okay. Let me get some of the bearings out. Okay, I've got two styles of bearings here. One is a flange bearing and one is just a straight bearing. They're the same size. One has a flange on it and the other does not. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Right there. Okay, this one here is flanged. This one here is plain. Oh, I can give you the numbers. I don't have them off the top of my head. They're on there, but you can't hardly read them. But anyway, what I've done, this is a piece of, I think it's 3/4 inch PVC. And you have to take I use a scraper and just go up in there. Actually, I use a milling adapter. I use and I just enlarge this hole just a little bit. I think the OD of these are about 7/8 of an inch. You want a little bit of a loose fit because you're going to epoxy them in. So you could epoxy a regular one in and then one of these. But what I do before I epoxy those guys in, I take the fitting, the barb fitting. This is not the right size. It's you want to get the 1/8 inch, just a 1/4 inch, and you put this in your lathe, and you take a file and just turn it, and you only have to file off a small amount. Then now you can take that and slip it right into those two bearings. It'll fit right into the two bearings, and you put some epoxy on there, and you slip them in there. Let it dry overnight. Now you have a piece that's ready to slip inside a piece of PVC that you've machined out a little bit, and you epoxy it in there. And that's about all there is to it. You're going to leave a space, and there I take a piece of wood, hardwood, and I put it in my lathe. I turn it to this dimension, drill it, tap it for the 1/8 inch NP thread of what this is, and just screw it in like so, and epoxy it, or put you can put CA glue in there or anything. It's not going to leak really. I'll show you on this one here. I'm going to I can't put hose on this because he's got a quick disconnect. Yeah. Anyway, if I was to put a hose on this right here and put my finger on it, it would be zero. I mean, zero loss at all. There's just no loss in this one here. Any of these small ones I've made. And you'd think this one here, because it's sloppy, is no loss at all on that. But you really only use your own imagination how you want to build one of these. You could build them out of just about anything at all in any way. So you're trying to just keep the bearings away from this piece right here so that you have a revolving piece. That's all. It can be any size. So, and they're fun to make. I've enjoyed doing this. I know you can go online and buy all this stuff, but like I say, I've got a few hours just playing around with all these different things, and I started out with the big ones, and I worked down to smaller and smaller. And the smaller I got with them, the less loss I had. It made me realize, well, yeah, I'm fighting all this extra bearing space in there that's incorporating an area into it. So, but these bearings are just very inexpensive. Amazon, just make sure you get double sealed, not shielded, because shielded is metal. You want rubber seals in them, neoprene seals, and these are double. And you could use the one with the ring with a hub on it, or you can just use two of these and just slip them in, and they will work. So I think there's any need to go too much deeper into this. If anybody decides they want to try to build these, and they run into a wall, give me a call. I'll help you through them. But I don't know how many people will try it. But this here is something I just grew up with in the last few days, and I've already made several for my lathe, and that's slick. One face plate, one adapter with the compression fitting in it, and you can get these in a 4-inch, 3-inch, 5-inch, anything you want. But it does not leak. It's amazing.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.